Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's video I'm going over some really major news from Valve, specifically talking about the new improvements to the index that they seem to be making. A new patent has recently been filed online, or rather discovered, but filed still relatively recently, that now seems to be alluding to the Vive getting some sort of wireless functionality in addition to eye tracking and potentially inside-out tracking as well. Now this is all really big, major news, considering the fact that Vive and other manufacturers have had wireless solutions such as like TPCast for quite some time, but there haven't really been any updates made to these systems for quite some time, and in that short space Oculus has had a chance to catch up using a pretty great streaming algorithm over 5 gigahertz networks for the Oculus Quest and the Quest 2. So now with Valve finally getting back into the scene and introducing this new variation of the headset, it's not 100% clear if we're going to see this make it to the index as it is right now, despite promises a couple years back that the wireless solution was coming to the index at some point. This looks like a ground up design, and might as well be, because the index is quite frankly a little bit long in the tooth at this point. Now, you might be wondering why, given that it's only been out for about 2 years or so, how come, I'm saying that this is something that needs to happen? And the reason is because, quite frankly, just about everybody else is kind of caught up in this space so far. And again, Vive being pretty much the only platform where the wireless solution is actually decent and works really well, it seems like competition is definitely in order, considering the fact that at $350, the Vive wireless solution is already pretty expensive on its own. But again, the index being at $1,000 price point as well is certainly something that bites, and still there's not a whole lot of stock, but hopefully with this new headset they'll do a little bit more of a refresh. Now, the really nice thing about Valve doing this is that we've not been seeing a whole lot of wireless solutions really hit the market. TPCast has been lagging behind creating their solution for quite some time, despite promising that they will support higher resolution headsets very soon, and we still haven't seen that come to pass. But now we do see some solutions coming from Sony's side that hint at PSVR 2 potentially being a wireless design, or at least using something like a single wire. So there's some speculation there as to what we might be seeing. However, they definitely are losing market share because the Oculus system has been just absolutely decimating the charts for quite some time. So with this new development, we should see a lot more traction in the VR space for Valve, and specifically we should see potentially higher adoption from people that have before been pretty much like very against VR just because of all the wires that have been hanging out just about all over the place, and setting it up, putting ceiling hooks in. None of that stuff is a whole lot of fun. Me personally, I've always been against wires in VR just because getting tangled in your own cord is frustrating. Using the ceiling hooks, again, depending on where you live, may damage the ceiling that you have, and also they're not exactly the best way of handling cable management. Over time, they will make your cable dangle and get tangled up, and so in either case, it's just not the best way to experience VR. Wireless really is the way to go. But the other big point here is the eye tracking. Now, with Valve getting in on this, we should see a lot more eye tracking coming into other VR headsets, because with them making this announcement, this is just absolutely massive news. Now, before, eye tracking hasn't really been as big of a deal, but nowadays with VR headsets, becoming more and more expensive, and with you having to drive the higher end VR headsets because of their resolution, it means it generally requires higher horsepower. Now, when you add eye tracking, and specifically gaze tracking, at that point where it's able to determine where the pupils of your eyes are looking, you are able to introduce something called foveated rendering. Now, this is obviously not a new technology. It's been talked about a number of times, and I believe there was even a headset called Fove a little bit back that actually used this sort of methodology to essentially just make the area where your eyes are looking really sharp, and have everything else be delivered at a lower resolution, thus saving your GPU from having to render all of that and essentially making the load on your system a lot less, meaning that you could still run games at essentially a higher resolution within that specific space, potentially even pushing super sampling without having to actually have the most beefy GPU. And this is just absolutely incredible, because if that does become a mainstay in VR, and with Valve pushing it forward as much as they are, this is going to be a game changer for VR as a whole. Because again, the hurdles to getting into VR, of course, are the initial hardware purchase, and that includes everything for the PC side as well, meaning that if you don't have to go out and buy the most expensive GPU just to play VR, that means a lot more people are going to get in on it. And ultimately, when you look at it from this perspective, more developers coming on board with eye tracking simply means better solutions for everyone across the board, and potentially it also means that eye tracking is going to be pushed out to a lot more headsets. At the time of writing, the Vive Pro Eye is pretty much sort of the main headset that includes it. Of course, we do have a number of prosumer grade or professional headsets that have eye tracking. For one, you've got the one that's been delivered called the Star VR. Star VR has had eye tracking since pretty much day one. They've been using this for a very long time. You've also got companies like Varjo that offer eye tracking in their system that, again, these headsets cost in the tens of thousands of dollars. You've got VRgineers who have also released their headsets that have eye tracking, and there are a number of other professional grade solutions that really just aren't worth the mention at this point, because most people watching this video and most consumers are probably never going to get their hands on this. And this technology is just simply way too far out of most people's wallet ranges, so to speak. So with somebody like Valve coming in and making this work is just going to be a boon to the industry. We're going to see a lot more of these manufacturers and developers start using this kind of tech. And of course, this is just massive. Now, the one downside, it seems that they are putting most of the electronics at this, at least at this point in the development, it's all going into a unit on the back of the head. So it's going to be towards the back of the skull with a little bit of extra padding added there so that it counterweights the front of the headset, potentially just making everything seem a little bit less strenuous on your head. But what this does also mean is that, from what I've personally experienced, the Vive Pro and the Vive, when you use the wireless system, they give you a battery pack that's about this size. I have it somewhere in storage lying around, but even with that battery size, you are only getting about maybe 2 to 4 hours of play, depending on the kind of games you were playing, also depending on how bright the screen had to get to, essentially display everything that you needed to see. So potentially in darker titles, you could get more runtime, as again, the OLED screens can just turn off those specific spots, so those light emitters are no longer working. Now, what I currently use is a battery pack, and it's massive. I believe it's 26,800 milliamp hours, so it's a very large battery pack. It takes up about this much space. I just have it hanging off my belt, and that gives me about 6 to 8 hours of play. Now, provided that Valve are able to come up with a battery solution that doesn't weigh as much as a brick and is able to fit into the back of this headset, potentially we may be able to see a good runtime, but it's also going to depend on what kind of panels end up being used in this headset and what sort of technology they're going to end up using for cooling. Because as it stands, if they're going to go with a 60 gigahertz band on this headset, this new HMD, then there's a good chance it's going to overheat. On my Vive Pro, I use the fan on the back of the wireless adapter. It's roughly a 40 mil fan just to keep things nice and cool. Now, if you don't use this, what typically happens is after about an hour of play or so, you start getting some weird kind of disconnects and you start getting artifacting because the adapter is no longer able to continue operating with that sort of heat in the system. Now, granted, you could probably come up with a better internal system for cooling, using something like a cooling loop, potentially just like a closed loop that uses phase change cooling, or just a bigger heatsink. But all of these solutions have a tendency to add additional weight, so we'll see what Valve ends up doing about this kind of setup. But the really other important part here, the really big part, is that we're finally seeing Valve go in the direction of inside-out tracking, it seems, with this particular HMD and this setup. And what I think this means, at the end of the day, is that we're probably going to see Valve moving away from the laser tracking that they've been using with the outside-in kind of setup, and that just means, again, it's a lower barrier of entry for people because they're not going to be having to drill holes in walls to set up base stations. They're not going to have to set up poles to put these base stations up in, and then routing all the wiring, etc. Again, just simplifying the entry into VR and the first time setup for the user. Now, granted, anybody who's got a dedicated room for this kind of stuff probably doesn't have to mess with their setup too much, but if you're somebody that likes taking this thing to their friend's house and showing it off, again, if you've got a portable PC nowadays, which, it's entirely possible to have, a PC that's, let's say like a 3-liter or 4-liter PC that's got enough room for your 3080, what have you, and a nice fast CPU in there, you're going to be able to take that thing to someone's house and play, so that's not really a factor here nowadays, and backpack PCs have been a thing for quite some time. But with that said, I suppose it's also entirely possible that they may also start looking at some kind of solution where they actually stream these games to this headset. We'll see what happens. Right now, a lot of it's still up in the air. However, this thing looks really cool. I'm really glad that Valve is finally sort of waking up and giving this news out to the gamers, even if unofficially, but hopefully an official announcement will come down the pipe pretty soon, given that the last thing Valve really did was the G2 Reverb with HP, and as cool as that headset is, it's still a WMR experience, so it's not exactly the best type of VR out there, and certainly not the best input method. So we'll see what happens with this particular headset, but stay in touch, like the video if you like this content, and again, I'll see you guys in the next news update.